going to talk about building and maintaining and the liability of having private recreational tours or trails. Jamie and I had a short discussion when we talked about this initially, because I have a woods that I had a neighbor who wanted to go riding through my woods, and I said, I'd prefer you not. And they did it anyhow. And so that's some of that legal side that you're going to have to deal with, but there's also a way to make certain that your trails are well taken care of and put in properly. So with that, Jamie, let me get out of this and stop sharing. And the rest is up to you.
So good morning.
Hampton, from our Auglaize County Extension Office, our Ag&R person up there, and has a horse fetish. I'll just put it jokingly that way.
Yeah.
So up to you. All yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Hampton, and I am going to share some information with you today. All right. Can everyone see that okay?
You're good.
All right. So my name's Jamie Hampton. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator in Auglaize County, which is West Central Ohio. I'm one county over from Indiana. So it's very flat and not as many recreation trails as I would like to have. But there's some really nice places to walk, and we do have the Miami Area Canal, which is really kind of a cool place to go hiking. But my passion is trail riding on horses. And using that, I'm going to give you some pointers and tips on maybe putting in and maintaining your own private trails on your property. All right, so when you're thinking about building and maintaining private trails, there are some things that you need to keep in mind. Like, you need to start with what is the purpose of your trails? Why are you putting them in? What are you going to do with them? You need to consider your investment limits, not only just financially, but physically, the limits on the natural resources in your area, and whether or not you need to, be aware of endangered species in that area. You want to consider the width of your trails, the difficulty level, safety measures, and conservation practices. So what is the purpose of your trail? Are they just for recreation? Or will you be using them for, exercise for yourself, for your horse, to walk your dog? What is the purpose? Some people use trails for education things. So like, you'll see, information placards around when you're hiking certain trails. If you're using it for exercise, you will see different exercise tools. Like, I have seen the pull-up bars and things like that in different locations as well. With horses, sometimes we like to have different challenges for our horse. So a wooden bridge or a teeter-totter, or maybe, a rope gate, mailboxes, things that we can use to challenge our animal is another thing that we think about when we're looking at the purpose of our trails. If your purpose is very simple, you may not be putting in an elaborate trail, whereas the more elaborate the purpose, the more elaborate the trail is going to be. The next thing to consider is your investment limits. You need to make a budget before you begin. So you've got to consider your financial investment. How much money do you have to put in up front? And how much money will you have for a rolling investment in those trails? Because they will need to be maintained every year. There's also the time investment. Your time now is going to be a little larger than what your time is in the consecutive years, but it will be something that you'll have to invest that time. You can consider, your natural resource investment. What is the cost to the natural resource environment, to the wildlife in that area, maybe to the wildflowers? There are different things that will have a consequence. There will be a decrease in wildlife biodiversity, and you can run into like fragments of habitat and impacts on survival and reproduction of some of your big game animals. Another thing to consider is the width of your trails. Some trails are a nice, narrow, one-horse path. Some are much wider for things like ATVs, or maybe you're putting in a path for exercise. You want it wide enough that you can run with your dog. So they should be wide enough to accommodate your riding needs and to be safe from, say, stray branches. So the width of just where your feet are isn't the only thing to consider. You must also think about your entire space, that bubble you have around your person and your animal, making sure that that's cleared of debris so that it is a safe place for you to walk. Width will also play a factor when you're determining the difficulty level of your trails. So when you think of difficulty level, most people really don't think about how difficult trails can be. So if you're just a beginner yourself, or your horse is a beginner, or you're building trails for beginners to learn on, you want to make sure that you've got smooth surfaces, not a lot of incline and decline, and that there are few to no obstacles in the way. If you're a more intermediate rider, you might have some more terrain changes. There may be some logs to make obstacles with, things of that sort. Your more intermediate riders are maybe going to have a platform, but maybe not a teeter-totter for their horses. They may have, steps for exercise, but not a chin-up bar. So that's your more intermediate level. Your difficult terrain, this is difficult ups and downs, difficult obstacles that require skill, not only for the rider, but for the animal that is also with you when you're doing that. So I do not ride difficult terrain. My horse is not trained for that. Neither is my dog. She would rather sleep in the living room if she had her way. But those are considerations. And be honest with yourself when you're looking at this and deciding, is my ability more than my horse, or am I thinking I'm better than I really am? And you can have some, I'll call it gray area between the beginner and that intermediate. It is kind of a sliding scale. So if you're a beginner, but a little more advanced beginner, you can have some more difficult things in your trail, maybe some switchbacks, maybe a little more grade. But you don't want to get some rough surfaces in there. You want to make sure that that change is gradual until you and your animal are experienced in that. The next thing to look at is your safety measures. You want to make sure that your trails are all safe for you and your animal. You'll want to watch for, when you build your trails, make sure you're not going to run into erosion problems where you get soft footing. You'll want to ensure that if you're riding along a terrain, that you have something there to help hold that. I'm sure that if you've walked some public trails or ridden public trails, you've seen where they've taken logs and some rebar or stakes to help hold that trail in place. A lot of trails are reinforced, so that's something to keep in mind. The next thing is rider safety. Make sure that you're clearly marked. I try to avoid wearing wildlife colored clothing when I'm out trail riding, because you never know. There's a hunting season for everything almost year round in my experience. So I'm always wearing something orange or yellow, maybe something reflective, something to let people know that, hey, I'm a person. I also add tail strips and leg wraps to my horse that are hunter orange, so that people can recognize that this is a recreation animal, not a wildlife animal to be hunted. And then you need to consider the liability of the landowner. Yes, we're on private ground, but there's people that sneak in there that maybe shouldn't be. So that's why you want to make sure that everything's as safe as possible. And when it comes to liability, I am going to leave that to Peggy because that is her expertise. and she is really good at that. The biggest thing for me when I think about building trails and getting trails put in is the conservation practices that you need to consider. These need to be thought about. There are guidelines for trail installations. NRCS, USDA.gov has a trails and walkways conservation practice standards that you can look at. You'll need to check to see if in your area, if there is any environmentally sensitive things, like endangered species, maybe wetlands, endangered wildflowers. You need to make sure that you don't have problems with that when it comes to putting in your own trails, because those trails can disrupt that natural growth cycle. So you don't want to get into any problems there. If you're in like swampy land or highly erodible land, there are steps you can take to build more environmentally conscious trails. Another thing to consider is steps for erosion reduction. So if you have a trail that has an incline or a decline, you'll want to put things in to help slow the water. You want to try to keep the trail disruption as low as possible. So adding things like mulch to help protect the soil, using, you can see in this image, they have old railroad ties spaced out so that, it'll slow down the water and it slows down the erosion. Consider plant life and water quality in the area. If you're disrupting that ground and you get some erosion, that can cause water quality problems. And a big one for me is litter control. I've always been, if you carry it in, carry it out. You don't want to leave trash. And if there's extra trash, go ahead and pick it up. On the property that I had, there was always trash blown in from somewhere. And I mean, things that you would wonder, how in the world did that get there? It can still show up. So I always carried an extra bag with me, usually like an old Walmart sack in my pocket for trash as I was hiking. And also consider if you take your pets, if they do go to the bathroom on the trail, you might want to flick it into the forest. You can flick it with a stick or whatever, but then it'll biodegrade naturally. You don't want to necessarily leave that in the middle of your trail because you don't want to have to step in that later. With your erosion stuff, you also want to consider going back and forth with your trails and having switchbacks. It is not necessarily safe to have a steep incline if you're not experienced with that, but it also causes more erosion problems. So if you can do switchbacks, that will help reduce the erosion as well as reducing water flow rates. So that's always a good thing to consider. When you're putting in new trails, after you get those trails established, you'll want to look and replant the disturbed area with native species to that area. Avoid putting in any species that are not part of that natural environment because we don't want to encourage invasive species spreading. So, if you're putting a trail through a sugar bush, then maybe just plant some new maple trees. I'm sure that there's specific maple trees that probably should be planted. So just do your homework and make sure that you know what should be put in there. When you're putting in your trails, consider the natural flow of the area. A lot of times you'll find deer paths that the deers are taking the easiest possible way through the woods. And some of those turn out to be pretty nice trails. I've put in trails of my own that just followed the deer's path. I put in conservation practices along those trails as I built them. So this is a really nice thing to do. And you want to also consider with the conservation, not dissecting existing growth when possible. So, if I've got a nice patch of a specific wildflower growing, I want to go around that instead of right through the middle of it so that I don't dissect that growth pattern. As you're putting in your trails, you'll want to reduce the disturbance as much as possible. If you're just going to have recreation trails. It's a little easier that way. If you're putting in high traffic trails, you might need to bring in some equipment and put those trails in, but always go back and try to return it as natural as possible. You'll also want to consider putting in barriers to discourage off-trail adventures, especially with being mushroom season. If you're allowing other people into your woods to use your trails, you'll want to let them know, hey, I'd rather you didn't go off trail, but you could also like maybe plant some native species that will grow a little thicker along certain areas to kind of discourage people from going off trail in that area. Yeah, so again, adding native species helps with erosion control. It helps to keep the environment natural. And it also does help with water quality. The more growing species you have, the more filtered that water will be before it hits a water source. I found this chart I thought was a pretty interesting little thing that I could share with you. This is your flight initiation disturbance of selected Arkansas wildlife species. I don't imagine it'd be a lot different here in Ohio. So like if you can see the white-tailed deer, their flight distance is 328 feet. So if you have a lot of deer in your woods and you would like to keep that, you'll want to try to make sure that there's enough space between trails that the deer have an area where they feel safe. Bald eagles, flight distance as low as 165 feet, but it can be as large as 2,900 feet. I know in one of the woods that I ride in, they've restricted specific trails because we have a set of nesting bald eagles. So that part of the trail is no longer used. We're not allowed to ride there anymore because it does get into that flight initiation distance. So it's a very interesting thing to consider and to take a look at. Well, and I guess that comes to the end of my slides. There was a few things that I kind of skipped over that I'd like to point out. I enjoy my trails a lot for more than just one thing. My recreation trails are also my exercise trails. So I used to take my horse with me when I would go walking, and we would walk the trails together. So, your trails don't have to be just one thing. They can be used for multiple things. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap it up. I'm sorry it's a little short, and I can take any questions that you have.
Okay, we've got a few. So one of the first ones, Jamie, was from Deb Heron, and will the webinar deal with good surfaces on woodland trails? Is there anything you want to add about good surfaces?
Yeah, again, you need to do your homework, be aware of what kind of soils are in your woods. You can look at different soil type maps. I don't know I imagine you could probably pull a soil sample in your woods. You can even grab a handful of soil and you move your organic matter out of the way, grab a handful of soil, get it a little wet, and start to try to push out a ribbon. You can see the instructions for this online. And if you get a pretty decent ribbon, then you got some pretty good soil that's not going to fall apart quickly. But if it's got a lot of sand in it and that breaks quickly, you're going to want to look at ways to help control the erosion on that. Maybe adding some mulch, maybe adding some gravels, different things that you can add to that to help shore up that trail.
Okay. Let me flip here for a minute. Chris Kenny put a link to a Forest Service pub on managing land trails, trail management tools. So that's in the chat box.
That's got
Okay.
a lot of great information. So definitely check that one out.
Yep. Okay, so the next one is Bob Ball asks, Our logging roads have heavy use by our hunt club and farm activities. Trail segments are steep and erosive, although properly constructed. Can you offer suggestions for vegetating shaded areas or using materials like wood chips, etc., to stabilize our trails?
I would definitely do a little homework and find out what your native species are in that area. A lot of your soil and water conservation districts can help you get a hold of some different types of seeds, maybe when they're doing their tree sale, as well as, reach out to your local extension and find out what your native species are and just plant as many native species as your area can handle. As far as the erosion control on the logging roads, like I said, I like to use old logs with maybe some spikes to hold that log in place to slow down some of that erosion. Maybe putting in some railroad ties with step downs to help slow the water erosion. And in areas where you're getting a lot of runoff, you can look into adding stabilizers like some gravels or mulches to help slow that water as well.
And there may be some things to look at in like logging BMP guides, things that maybe weren't put in the logging road initially when the job was done, but things that after the fact may help move some of the water off the trail. And that would be another source to look at. I'll see if I can find some links and put them in the chat as well. We have an anonymous, it says, please discuss hiking and ATV trails too.
Well, I mean, your hiking and ATV trails will follow a lot of the same guidelines, I think. Make sure they're safe, make sure that they're appropriate for the difficulty level of the riders. I mean, safety measures. You can't say it enough, especially if you're out riding ATVs on trails. Make sure that you can see where you're going, make sure that the underbrush is trimmed back enough that you're not going to get whacked in the head with a branch or, things like that. That's never fun. So a lot of these guidelines will go right along with the same stuff.
Okay. Jane asked about getting a copy of the slides, and I will say that everything's being recorded and will be posted online. If you'd want a presentation or a copy just of Jamie's slides, her email is up on the screen right now. I would say email her and let her send it your way.
Absolutely.
That way, so that you can use it. So she wants to share it with others in her wooded West Virginia community. Okay, so Chuck says, what was the name of the Trail Conservation Practices Guide that you mentioned?
I will find it and throw it in the chat. It was nrcs.usda.gov. And they had several different guidelines for different types of trails. The one I was looking at was trails on small acreage. I can find that and throw that in the chat.
Okay. Mike asks, any guidance regarding drain tiles / culverts under wet spots?
Again, you need to make sure that it's not listed as a wetland area, because if it is, there are different regulations with that. As far as culverts go, on my own personal property where I did not have a wetland, it just happened to be where the water would come down off the hill. We dug in a culvert and put railroad ties on the sides to indicate where, this is where the bridge is, so that we knew when we were riding our horses, and just covered it with, we put in heavy gravel and then light gravel on top, and then covered it with some limestone shavings, and I didn't have any problems with it.
Okay. Susan says, can you discuss, and this has been a little bit a while ago, can you discuss a little further some different erosion control methods? And you've hit some of those.
Mm-hmm.
one of them, and I see one of them you can think about, and it just depends on what the trail is, what the condition of the trail and how much water you're seeing. You can, create like log, I don't want to necessarily call them log mats, but
Right.
you can create with small pieces that you can walk over, you can ride over, but they allow some moisture to move through without having issues on without sitting, because what you're trying to do is move the water, right?
Yeah.
You don't want the water to sit on the trail. So
yeah. Again, I can't stress enough, make sure you do your homework before you put in your trail, so you know what you're going to run into, and be prepared, because there are going to be things that pop up that's like, ta-da,
yeah.
here we go. Yeah, corduroy roads.
Yes, thank
So,
you.
So do your homework, make sure that you read up on it, and reach out to Extension. We're glad to help when it comes to that.
And we do have a BMP book for Ohio logging jobs, and that kind of goes along with dealing with trails and grassing the things in when you're talking about logging roads and log landings, and some of that can apply here as well. So there is one of those for the state that goes with our laws and regs for dealing with soil erosion on logging jobs. So that's another good source. As Nancy says, I leave the logs across some of my trails. What do you think?
I would say that's your difficulty level. If you've got a small log and a young horse that's learning, probably not going to be a big deal if you're an experienced rider. But if my 6-year-old niece is riding her pony, I'm not going to have any logs across the trail because she's just learning. Myself, I get some pretty big ones, and my old fat horse kind of has to jump a little bit sometimes to get over them. But again, back to your difficulty level, that's, those are obstacles for you and your horse.
Dub says, how do you deal with water runoff across the trail? Bridges to include plastic piping?
Sometimes, if you've got a creek that you don't want to ride through, that is an option. If you're riding through a creek, there are best management practices about creek crossings that we want to consider. And if you're dealing with just like a wet area, like we talked about doing a corduroy road, maybe putting in some gravel to help with that drainage. Or you can always, go further and dig it out and put in a bridge.
And they don't have to be fancy bridges. I mean, sometimes if you look at what we call mud mats for logging jobs, again, I keep kind of going back to that, but there's definitely some options there if you think about how you're just trying to move that water off. I was trying to find another link to post in the let me see if it's not where I thought it was. Anyhow, so there are simple things like open culvert, open what we call kind of a box culvert that is like 2x4s, 3 2x4s. So it's not super wide, but it's just enough to create a path across the trail. You have to be leery about if you're doing horses, that it's not going to create an issue with the horses. I've seen some folks put like mesh across the top so that you could still, keep some things out, but not everything, but it would still move water. And so I will, while Peggy's talking, I'll do some digging and see if I can find those connections for you and put those in the chat as well. Okay. Ralph says conveyor belt water bars are great and durable for trails that have heavy vehicle use. And I was thinking about water bars when we were first talking, but if you're using the trail also for vehicles, that can be a little uncomfortable because you're doing this kind of up and over for the water bars. But if you're horseback riding or walking, that's not as big a deal. And so, yeah, you could do some great water bars to move water off the trail. And then Tom says, is digging ditches on the side of the trails to move water an acceptable practice?
I would say with that one, you need to make sure that you're following soil and water conservation guidelines. Kind of check into that. If you're putting in trails and you know it's a wet area, you're going to use probably some different construction material. Where on my dry land, I can use some mulch to help control erosion. If yours is wet consistently, you might have in a gravel path, or you might put in other water control measures to help, dry that trail out a little bit more. And it'll probably be, kind of constructed a little differently because you want that water to run off the trail, not to settle on the trail. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely check with your soil and water district to see what regulations you have in your area. But I have seen some people ditch, along the side of their trail. I've seen people put in tile along the side of their trail to help move that water out. So there are options, and it's definitely something to look into.
In your soil and water district, Jamie's right. They can really help with the drainage. I mean, they're very good at that. That's kind of one of their specialties. And so they understand the soils in the county, and they're, part of their goal is to move water places. And so, yeah, their expertise can really help when it comes to that. If you've got a forester in your woods, you can also talk to them about moving that water when we talk about best management practices for jobs. So, okay.
Hey, Jamie.
Yes.
Can you give an example of maybe maintenance along a trail that you've created? Just, a personal example of
absolutely
what you do annually, or something that you came across that you had to fix.
Okay. So with my trails, I have a horn bag on my saddle, and in that bag I have pruners. I have one of those fold up little hand saws. Because they're my private trails, I have to maintain them regularly. So as I'm riding, if I see like briars starting to grow in a little bit, I'll stop and I'll cut those off and throw them off to the side out of the way. And that's a regular maintenance. Almost every time I'm out, I'll trim back things that are in the way. Yearly, so like this time of the year, a little earlier, when it's nice like it has been, I'll go out with the chainsaw and the wagon, and we'll cut out any logs that have fallen onto the trail that I don't want in that spot. I check for erosion problems. So one of my side logs, there was a little hole where it started eroding underneath of it. I packed that with some rocks and backfilled it so that would help slow down that erosion. So every year, on a yearly basis, you'll want to walk through, not ride through, walk through and take a good look for erosion issues, look for rot issues in your steps, look for encroachment of other plant species, to make sure that everything's still in good working order. You'll want to check the footing of your trail to make sure that you don't have soft spots developing. I have seen that happen where all of a sudden there's a spring that pops up in the middle of your trail and you're like, really? So, then you got to cut that out and around. And again, you'll want to watch for, so like in the area that I'm in, sometimes we get bald eagle nests. And if I get a bald eagle nesting in my woods, I need to find out if I need to change my trail. So maybe you might have to do a little homework after the fact to make sure that you're not causing any problems for the wildlife in that area, especially for endangered species. So, and I watch my creek. If there's muddy water in my creek, then there's something going on and I've got to go check my trails. So that's, just regular maintenance, being observant, taking the time to walk the trails and taking care of problems as they come up.
Okay. So in the link, I just put a link in there that goes to DNR Division of Forestry's website, and it's their erosion page. And on there is a link to their PDF for the BMP book for logging. And so a lot of what we were talking about, the water bars and all of that, is detailed in there on how to construct and those kind of things. So you can download that PDF and access that info. And like I said, there's a lot of things in there that I think work here as well. Because a lot of our trails, I mean, that's where the horseback rider that was next to me wanted to ride, was old logging roads. And they just were not put in to be horseback trails.
Right. Yeah,
And
there
I
are safety issues with that.
Yes,
So you do need to check into that.
Yeah. So,
But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. You've got my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll answer questions that anyone has and share my resources, as well as reach out to Extension in your local county. We all have, these things available and are glad to share them or put you in contact with people that can share resources.
okay.
Thank you,
All
Jamie.
right. Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. Lots of good info, lots of great
Thank
pictures.
you.
So up next, I don't know, Peggy, can we call this the fun part? No?
Probably not.
It's the equally important part.
But it is the equally important part, because as woodland owners, you get a lot of requests for using your property, whether it's trails or whether it's mushroom hunting and lots of other things and you're always worried, right? I mean, as a woodland owner, I worry about letting folks on the property that I don't know very well, and what are my liabilities and so especially when you have trails, there's that kind of increases the chances for use. And again, so what do I need to be worried about as a landowner? So I'd like to introduce Peggy Hall. Peggy she's an attorney, and she is part of our Ag and Resource Law program at Ohio State. She was a great resource for us. And we were actually, I have to tell you, Peggy and I were having a discussion about how extension people can't say no when we get requests to do programming. And I looked at her and I said, so did you see my email asking you to do this webinar? And she says, yeah, I can do that. Case in point. So Peggy, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And you're right. We can't say no. I'm about, I don't know, quarter of a mile from the beach here. It's calling to me, but I'm going to talk to you all about liability first instead. As Kathy mentioned, I'm out of state. I'm down in South Carolina right now, having some quiet time. But here we are talking about liability for private recreational trails, which is, liability is one of the most common questions we receive in our Ag and Resource Law program. Just, will I be liable if this or that? And so certainly when we're talking about people engaging in activities on your property, that's an important question to ask and make sure that you understand the answer. The answer is not actually as simple as we would like it to be. And so I'm going to work through the laws that do help us answer that question, as well as some other tools and practices that can help answer that question. And in regards to the topic for today, it's not uncommon to ask this, especially because we do have those people engaging in physical recreational activities on the property. And that certainly adds another concern on top of the typical concern for just having people on your land. But first, I want to tell you a little bit more about my program. I direct the Agricultural and Resource Law program at OSU. We're part of the farm office team that we have at OSU, and you can find all of our materials on farmoffice.osu.edu. It's a website that addresses agricultural law and farm management, which we do encompass rural land management within that broad umbrella of farm management. And I do a lot of resource law, what I would call natural resource law. And so that's all on there too. You can see our website here. We have an ag law library and an ag law blog where we constantly write and provide legal updates on issues that affect our ag and resource landowners in Ohio. We cover national issues as well. I know some of you are not from Ohio. There's our ag law library. You can find it there. A lot of topics that we cover there in the library. And then the blog that you can subscribe to. If you go to that blog page, you'll receive our blog posts in your email. So just wanted to let you know about us and our resources. As Kathy said, I'm an attorney. I have another attorney, two other attorneys who work for me. And so we try to cover as many legal issues and topics as we can on the farm office site. So question that I'm sure is on the minds of many of you. If someone asks to ride on your trails, whether it is a horse, an ATV, whether they're just walking, but they want to ride or use your trails, any kind of user, and they're injured while doing that, could you be legally liable for that injury? And I often tease my students at OSU that, well, you know, a really good answer for any legal question is it depends, because that's usually a very relevant answer. And that's certainly the case here. It depends. It depends on many different laws, what you did, what that person did, and what other tools or practices come into play. So let me start with the basic on how we would begin to answer that question if we just look at premises liability or landowner liability, as we call it generally. And for those of you who are out of state, not Ohio, I am using Ohio law, but this first part is pretty common to any state, this way of dealing with premises liability. So the general legal duty when we're talking about landowners, and I don't just mean landowners, a tenant who is in possession of the land can also be included as a landowner. So that's a rather broad category that addresses whoever is in control and possession of that land. So that, as we call it, landowner, has a general legal duty to take reasonable actions to keep those foreseeable property visitors safe from harm. That's the broad general duty that we have as landowners. And so that's the kind of approach we would use if we have friends or family or social guests over. Just, you know, make sure that you have taken reasonable cautions or precautions, actions to keep them safe from things on your property that could harm them. That's the general duty. But the duty changes from there in Ohio. Now, some states stay with this and apply this general legal duty to any kind of property visitor. But in Ohio, we start to play with it. We're one of the few states that still do this. And we adjust that legal duty depending upon why that person is on the property. I expect sometime in my lifetime, or before I retire even, that we may change this. There have been many efforts to change this approach that we still use in Ohio, which we call a classification approach. But for now, this is what we're dealing with. Some of you in other states have most likely gone away with this classification approach and just have this one general legal duty that applies to visitors. But in Ohio, we can go up and increase that legal duty, and you have a higher legal duty, and that higher duty is to seek out unknown dangers on your property. But that higher legal duty only applies to certain types of visitors. And so it's going to apply to those kinds of visitors that are on your property for your financial benefit. If you stand to gain from them, if they're there to help you with your business, or they're buying things, or you're charging them. So we put customers certainly into that category. So if you're going to be charging for your trail use, now you're looking in Ohio at having a higher legal duty to that person who is paying you to be there. And in that case, you're going to not just take reasonable actions, for those things that you see that might harm them. You've got to seek out and find things that might harm them. So that's why we call that a higher legal duty. On the other hand, we have a lower legal duty to people who are on the property as trespassers. So we're looking at those unknown trespassers that we don't know about. If we really don't know that they're there, then we have a very low legal duty to them. In that case, the low legal duty is simply to refrain from harming them when you do discover them. So you can't harm your trespassers, basically, but you have a low legal duty to keep them safe from anything on the property that might harm them. And that is, again, if you don't know about them being there. If you do know that you have trespassers and you have a trespassing problem, then they're going to fall into that middle category. And you do need to take some reasonable actions to protect those known trespassers from harm that they could incur, even though they're trespassing. Once you know about them, we go to that mid-level duty. So this is partly why it's hard to answer a liability question easily, because it depends on who they are and why they're there. So when we talk about the legal duty, then we have to ask, well, what do I do? What do you mean? How do I meet that legal duty? Well, so my recommendations for that, based upon how premises liability law works, is that you should just constantly be assessing your property conditions and remove those dangerous things on the property that you don't need, that could harm a visitor, even a trespasser, if you know about that trespasser. Or if you can't remove them, or you don't want to remove them, or you need them, they're part of your farming operation or part of your business, part of what you're doing on the property, then you need to take actions to provide warnings so that they don't come into contact, so that they're aware, so that they can protect themselves from those dangers on the property that can harm them. So warnings can come in many forms: signs, fencing, blockades, instructions, maps, anything like that lets them know, hey, stay away from here because you could be harmed. So if you remove something or you give an adequate warning, in the eyes of the law, you probably have met your legal duty. And if they're harmed anyway, then it's most likely their fault and not your fault. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we think about failing to meet the legal duty. So if you don't remove it, fix it, warn them, remove that possibility of them coming into contact with it, and they come into contact with it and are harmed, then of course you are looking at the possibility then of liability for their harm. And they would use a negligence cause of action typically for that kind of harm. So you could be deemed negligent and you could be liable for the harm that your negligence caused. But something to keep in mind, and this is very, very, very applicable to property premises liability, is that the visitor themselves can also be negligent. Sometimes they do things and they're partly responsible for their injuries. So we could be trying to balance who did what and how does liability come out. It's not common to see absolute liability completely against a landowner, because there is often this offsetting that occurs, that we have to look at both parties and what they did before we know who's liable for what. And also be aware that many times these kinds of property liability situations are going to be addressed in your property insurance and are likely, in many, many cases, likely to be covered by your insurance. And so your insurance provider would be involved and would represent and handle the matter. And of course, they're going to try to decrease that liability and point the finger at the other party as much as possible to reduce that liability. So that's the general rule, but in these kinds of situations that we're dealing with today, when we have people using trails on your property, there are exceptions to that general rule and that general legal duty that you have. And these come in the form in Ohio of immunity laws that replace the general rules and instead protect a landowner from liability, give them immunity from liability if the landowner qualifies for that immunity. So we can just throw the whole system that I just explained to you out the door if there is a completely relevant immunity law that applies to the situation, because that law is going to say, no, we are going to protect the landowner from liability in this type of a situation. And those are policy decisions that our legislatures have made over time, usually at the request of certain groups that do want to have that protection in cases where they are at a higher exposure, or in cases where they're doing something for the public good, like opening their land to people to use the land for recreation. So in all of those cases, the legislature has said, okay, yes, we want to give you immunity. We don't think you should be liable in this situation. So I want to explain those laws to you. And I added a slide quickly here once I saw that we had some people from out of state. So for those of you who are not in Ohio, you can, I think each of these laws, the first two laws that I'm talking about, I think just about every other state in the nation has a similar law. But the third one, the agritourism law, not as many states do have that. But to find your law in your state, you can go to the National Ag Law Center's website. I partner with the National Ag Law Center, and you can find many of our, from our Ag Law program, many of our resources on that site. And I've done a couple of these state compilations for the National Ag Law Center. This is the page where you can find where they will put any state that has a particular law, they'll bring it together in this state compilation. And I've put the website address there for you down at the bottom. So for instance, I'm going to be talking about agritourism laws. You can see we have an agritourism category there where they've compiled all agritourism laws across the country. There's also down further equine activity. I'll talk about Ohio's Equine Activity Act. That is the law that every other state does have now. So you could find your law there. And then down at the bottom, you see recreational use. I'll also be explaining our recreational user statute. And I do believe all other states in the nation now have a recreational user statute. So for those of you out of state, you can go there and find your laws. They're going to be similar to what I will explain here in Ohio, because we have developed model laws that we hand around and say, hey, Ohio, you need to develop, you need to draft and pass this model law. And the Recreational User Statute and Equine Activity Act are definitely model laws that are very similar across the country. And then we also have the agritourism immunity law. That one varies a little bit. Not as many states have passed it yet. It's a much newer law, but you can find that there are similarities even there from state to state. So these immunity laws could apply to private recreational trails, depending upon what the use is for that trail and how else you are using the property for other purposes. So let me explain them to you. Let's begin with the Recreational Users Statute. And this basically does remove liability, remove that legal duty, and says you don't have a legal duty to protect a recreational user. And you will not be liable for any harm that that recreational user suffers on your property. It's very, very protective of the landowner, or as I said, the possessor of the property. And this one even applies to the government. So the state of Ohio is protected by this law as well on all of their state lands. So we need to ask, well, who is a recreational user? What do you mean by that? Well, the law defines that. And a recreational user is someone who has permission to engage in a recreational activity on non-residential property. So that this doesn't apply at a house or the things in and around a house, but a farm a rural property out away, a woods, those are going to be deemed non-residential properties. And finally, the recreational user is not paying to engage in that recreational activity or giving a benefit to the landowner for engaging in that recreational activity. So this is the one where I said the state had a policy to say, hey, if you are opening your land, you people who own land, if you have this kind of, recreational land, and we have a lot of people in Ohio who want to use it, and you just allow them to use your land for recreational activities, then we're going to give you immunity because we want to encourage you to do that, and we want to protect you from any liability for the harm that they might suffer while they're engaging in those recreational activities that they've chosen to do on your property, and you're letting them do that for free. So it's a policy that all states in the nation have adopted, that these kinds of landowners that do open their property for free, so you can't be charging here, are going to get liability protection. Now, there is a strange little exception in Ohio where if you lease out your land and you receive some income for the lease, so like a hunting lease, this law would still apply there. So we even have taken it a step further in Ohio and protected those hunting lease situations and given those landowners immunity from liability for hunters who are leasing out the property. So this is the law itself. You can see we're in the Ohio Revised Code, and it states immunity pretty clearly that you do not have any duty to a recreational user to keep your property safe for them. You're not assuring them by giving them permission that the property is safe, and you have no responsibility or liability for any injuries that they incur for that recreational use. And you can see that it even goes on to say this applies to the owner, the lessee, or the occupant of any privately owned non-residential premises. And then also later it refers to the public uses that I mentioned. And it's not that you have to advertise to the world that your property is open for public use to all recreational users. So that's what B is stating down there. It's just that if someone comes to you and asks permission and you give it, that puts you immediately into this category of the recreational user statute coming into effect. So another thing to think about is, okay, so who's a recreational user? We know kind of what the land and the activity and the permission looks like, but what do we consider recreational uses? And there is a definition for that. Let's get to that. We have premises here, and I'm sorry, I pasted a couple of different provisions for you. Whoops, I must have pasted the wrong one. I thought I had the definition of recreational activities. You'll see in that definition, oh, there it is, okay. Hunt, fish, trap, camp, hike, swim, operate a snowmobile, all-purpose vehicle, four-wheel drive motor vehicle, or engage in other recreational pursuits. So I did have it there for you to say it's pretty broad. These are all considered recreational activities and pursuits that if you give permission to do those things and you don't charge them a fee, this law is going to apply and give you immunity. And as I said, all other states have a very similar version of that law. Now let's turn to equine specifically, because all other states also have an Equine Activity Act. And what that law does is to remove liability for an equine activity sponsor. And that liability is going to be removed for any participants in equine activities if they're harmed as a result of an inherent risk of engaging in that equine activity. And please note that the definition of equine is broad. It's not just horses. It's any of those kind of hooved animals that we tend to ride for pleasure. So it can apply to many others that we tend or use, not just ride, but use for pleasure. So can apply to zebras and hinnies and donkeys and all of those kinds of equine fit under the state equine laws. So this applies though just to those harms that result as an inherent risk, due to an inherent risk of being around equine and engaging in equine activities. So what do we mean by that? Well, we all know, we've all been around these kinds of animals, and we know that they can be, you know, a little bit skittish or energetic. And that's what the law is trying to get at. Those kinds of risks that come with being around that type of animal, but you want to, so you've chosen to be. So we're going to say you should assume those inherent risks of being around these kinds of animals. So the propensity of them to behave in ways that could harm a person, their unpredictability, especially I used to trail ride all the time. And the thing I was always worried about was the snake. Boy, a snake comes out onto the trail and your horse, calm as it may be at all other times, may completely act differently when that happens. So that would be covered. That's an inherent risk. Any hazards, including but not limited to surface or subsurface conditions. And that's important when we're thinking about trails. So hazards due to surface conditions, that's considered to be an inherent risk if you're riding an equine. But there's an exception I'm going to tell you about in a moment. So hold on to that one. Colliding with other equines or animals or people. And finally, the propensity of someone else, another equine participant or the participant themselves, the one who is harmed, to act in a way that is negligent by failing to follow directions, for example, or failing to maintain control over their equine, or not doing as you instructed them to do. So as you can gather, this law is going to apply to those situations where you do want to charge people for those rides on your trails. You do want to have a fee. In this case, the law would say, well, that's fine. You can charge and we'll still give you immunity because you're an equine activities sponsor. And we want to encourage people to do that, to allow people to use their property for these equine activities. So even if you're charging, you're going to be protected from any harm that results because of those inherent risks of the equine activities. You can find the law here in the Ohio Revised Code. And you can see here that it does say equine means horses, ponies, mules, donkeys, hinnies, zebras, and alpacas. And I know we have a growing alpaca population in Ohio, so it would apply to them as well. And it applies to all kinds of activities. Trail riding would be one of them. This is only a part of the law. It's a very long, complex law, so I'm not giving all of it to you, but you can see just a little bit on how the law is laid out. So any sponsor of an equine activity would be a person who is, as you can see here, for profit or not for profit, organizing or sponsoring or providing facilities for these kinds of equine activities, or even if you're just promoting them. So anyone who has the land that's allowing, for instance, a 4-H club to come and ride, allowing others to use that property for their own organizational purposes, charging people to come and ride, any of those would fall under this. You are an equine activity sponsor definition, and the law would apply to you and give you immunity from those riders. Now, there are exceptions, though, to the immunity, and this is stated down further in the law that I was showing you. First, if they're your own horses and you're putting people on horses or zebras or alpacas, if you mismatch a horse and rider, you could get into trouble. So you put a little kid on your biggest, most energetic horse, that's a mismatch horse and rider situation. If you give faulty equipment or tack, that's a problem. But when it comes to trails, number 3 is, and number 4, I think are most relevant. First, if there are some unseen conditions of the property, of the land that they're riding on, something that they couldn't see at all that you know is there, We call those, in the eyes of the law, latent conditions. They're kind of sleeping conditions that people don't have the ability to protect themselves from because they can't see them. They don't know they're there. And so I'll let you think for a moment about, in the context of trails, what could those kind of hidden, latent conditions that you would know about, but they wouldn't know about, that could ultimately cause a fall or an injury, what would those be? Number 4 is an act or an omission that constitutes willful or wanton disregard for the participant. So what number 4 is saying is, we don't expect you to be perfect. We expect people to assume the risk of being on different kinds of equine and the potential that they could be harmed from that. However, if you are completely in disregard, we're going to pull back on that immunity, and we're going to question why you didn't do something. So there is a little bit of an expectation here that you do need to be aware of where they'll be riding, what they'll be doing, and not do something that's kind of reckless, and not warning them, or as I had mentioned before, maybe giving them an animal that is not, is not going to be something they can handle, not telling them, there's something really big and open and, scary, and you know it, and you don't tell them about it, and maybe they wouldn't see it. Those are the kinds of situations where the law is saying, we're not going to just let you, go free from any liability if there's something you could have done easily to protect somebody from what could be a significant harm. And then also, you can't do any intentional acts. That's not a surprise. That's an exception for immunity. Now, you might see in many places, on many farms, rural properties, people that have horses, equine, that they have this sign up, and it's just warning people saying, we're not going to be liable for you for engaging in an equine activity. This sign is not required by law. You still can obtain the immunity even if you don't have this sign up, but your insurance provider might want you to have it. It's a good idea to have it. It kind of puts people, in that mindset that, oh, I can't just, I better be careful here because I'm assuming the risk of engaging in this activity. But this is not required in Ohio. Now, some states do require that you have the sign posted in order to have that immunity. Ohio is not one of those states that require it, but can be a recommended practice. So law number 3 is our agritourism immunity law. This is the newest of the 3 immunity laws that we utilize commonly here in Ohio. And this is going to be one that applies to agritourism providers. So a question to ask yourselves, do you qualify as an agritourism provider? If so, then you have immunity from liability for harm that people suffer while they're engaged in an agritourism activity on your property, as long as that harm that they suffer is a result of the inherent risks of engaging in agritourism. So many of our farms that are adding agritourism, diversifying and having those kinds of activities, there are certain things that could fall under trail riding. We have people doing, horses, of course, but also maybe even I've seen, pedaled, non-motorized bicycles, motorized types of, whether it's a train they're going through the woods, wagon rides, all these different kinds of vehicles or modes of transportation that they're allowing people to go out in and around and through the woods as part of that experience of being on the farm and engaging in agritourism. So the agritourism law could apply in those situations. And this is one, unlike the recreational user statute, where you're allowed to charge a fee and benefit financially from that use if you're engaging in agritourism. So this is the law in Ohio, and you can see that it provides immunity from liability for agritourism providers. But part of the challenge, I guess, of this law is that you do have to be on a farm. that is engaged in agricultural production. So agritourism providers, for the purposes of this law, are going to be those people who own or operate or sponsor an agritourism activity, whether or not it's for a fee, but it's on a farm that's engaged in agricultural production. So if you simply have a woods and you're not agriculture or engaged in commercial agricultural production, this law might not apply to you. So any agriculturally related educational or recreational activity, as you can see on a farm, is going to be what qualifies. So some of you will qualify for this, some won't, based on the nature of your property and whether you are also engaging in commercial agriculture, along with having your woods and your trails. So a farm means that kind of a property. It's engaged in commercial agricultural production. It's either over 10 acres in size, or if it's under 10 acres, then it's receiving an average gross income of $2,500 or more from commercial agricultural production. And timber can qualify as agricultural production. So keep that in mind, but it needs to be also in tandem with other types of agricultural production. You can see here the language about timber that's in the second part here, the production for a commercial purpose of timber, or in the third one, the growth of timber for a non-commercial purpose if it's contiguous to land where there is commercial agricultural production taking place. So if you're in either of those situations, we could deem those trail riding uses to be agritourism activities because they're conducted on a farm. Hopefully that makes sense. So if your land, an easy way to look at this is if your land qualifies for CAUV, our current agricultural use valuation in Ohio, then you are a farm that's engaged in commercial agricultural production, and the agritourism law would apply to you and those activities that you choose to do on the farm, like trail riding by different types of trail users. So here's the immunity. You can see it in the Ohio Revised Code, and it talks about those risks that are inherent to engaging in agritourism activities, and it lays them out here as the surface and subsurface conditions of the land is the very first one listed. So there we're looking at those trails, the condition and surface of those trails, that's going to be deemed an inherent risk of engaging in agritourism if you're doing your activities on agricultural land where conditions are not, of course, going to be perfect. You can see too that the behavior of wild animals is in B, but down in C, the behavior of domestic animals is also covered. So if you are using your own animals here, we could also look to the agritourism law as well for that situation. And then you see other risks that the law defines: ordinary dangers associated with structures and equipment, normally used in farming, contracting illness, and the last one, similar to the equine law, the participant acting negligently is also considered a risk that would be covered by this law. Now for this one, you do need the sign, and you see the sign here on the right. This exact sign has to be posted on your property in a clearly visible location that's either at the entrance to the property or the site of your activity. So the entrance to the trail, I think, would be advisable here, that you have to have this sign posted. If you don't have the sign posted, you don't get the immunity that the law provides. And this is a very specific sign that you can get from Ohio Farm Bureau or from OSU Extension. So if you need that sign, feel free to contact me and I can help you with that. So those are the three laws, but I want to make a point, an important point here, and that is that you should not let immunity remove or reduce your need for good insurance. Insurance is the #1 way of reducing liability for landowners. It is the easiest, most comprehensive tool that we can use. And you can see here, there's an agritourism policy that I've shown you. That's becoming more common to have a rider or a specific policy for these kinds of additional activities that we might be engaging in on our agricultural or rural land. So that's a conversation to have with your insurance provider, and make sure that you are tailoring your insurance coverage to the activities that you're allowing or, purposefully engaging in on your property. So if you are going to allow trail riders, and Kathy said she was a little bit worried about that, well, talk to your insurance provider. What kind of coverage do I have? They know about these immunity laws, and so they take that into consideration when they assess the risk and when they set their prices and costs for that insurance coverage. They are assessing, what's the risk that it won't be covered, that you won't be immune, and what additional coverage might you need. And you need to update that policy whenever you do allow new activities to take place on your land or start a new business, as we might do with using trails and charging people. You need to let your insurance provider know and make sure that's covered, or if not, get that additional coverage. I can't overstress how important insurance is when it comes to premises liability for landowners. Another question I often receive is, well, can't I just have them sign a waiver and not worry about anything? And the answer is, well, no, that can be useful, but no, you can't sit back and not worry about anything. A waiver is not going to be a guarantee that you will be immune. And in Ohio, and this is fairly common in other states too, courts are a little bit skeptical, I guess, of waivers. They don't like to just let someone off the hook because they forced somebody to sign a waiver. And so if you're in that situation where you want to come and use my property, okay, and then they show up and you say, oh, but first you have to sign this waiver, you didn't give them any opportunity. You're kind of forcing them into signing that legal document and waiving all their legal rights. And courts don't really like to uphold that kind of a situation. But if you have a carefully written waiver that goes exactly to that specific activity, it's very carefully drafted, and you give people advance notice, you have them sign it before they ever show up, so they know that they have a right to refuse it and don't even have to come. In those situations, courts might allow that waiver to stand. And in fact, in our equine activity law, down toward the end of it, it does address waivers, and it says waivers are still good. You don't have to use the immunity law if you have a well-written waiver that accomplishes what we're trying to accomplish with this law. Then this law is not going to remove or void that waiver. So they're okay, but I would recommend, if you want to have a waiver, work with an attorney and make sure it's carefully drafted. Some great big old waiver that says, I'm not going to be liable for anything, and you agree that you're never going to try to make me liable, that's not going to hold up in court as a well-written waiver that removes your legal liability. So be aware of that. And finally, I just want to review just a few considerations, to think about. If you do have trails, do you want to charge for those? Because as you now know, your duties can vary and the immunity laws vary depending upon whether you're making money from that trail use. Are you able to get out there and regularly assess and maintain those trails? Jamie talked a lot about what that involves. If you can't, then you're putting yourself in a higher risk category. And so you might need to give that some careful consideration. Make sure you have specific insurance coverage for that activity that you want to do. Do you want to use a waiver? If so, make sure it's carefully written by an attorney. And basically, is it worth the risk to you, that potential risk? We have a lot of good protection in Ohio that could reduce your liability, but do you still want to take the risk despite those laws that can apply to those situations? So when we come back to that question, if someone asks to ride your on your trails or use your trails and they're injured, could you be liable for their injury? Well, you know, it depends on all these things. What legal duty did you have? What kind of visitor are they? What actions did you take as far as maintaining and reducing the risk of that dangerous thing that harmed them or warning them about it? What did that harmed person do? We have to look at that. And is there a specific immunity law that says, no, you're fine, you're not going to be liable for this? And then finally, how does your insurance apply to that situation? Because that can go a long way toward reducing your liability risk. So with that, are you guys all still there? Happy to answer any questions that we might have.
Cool. Thank you, Peggy. That was great.
You're welcome.
And as I'm sitting here as that woodland owner, I'm kind of going through your process. So it was.
Yeah. So what did you think? Did you come up with some questions? Anything unclear?
Actually, we have 14 different questions for you.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And actually that's a small number compared to sometimes, but we'll work our way through. And for me personally, you answered most of mine. And I'm just one of those that it's like, I just am not super comfortable with someone I don't know on the property. And I think I'm still gonna keep it there.
Right. I think that's, so for you, it's not worth the risk. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yep.
Because I mean, I'm not going to be maintaining trails. They were put in for logging purposes and not meant to be recreational trails. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think for my purposes to bring them up to speed would just be over and above what I would want to do. So, okay, so let's see here. Ronald asks, he says he's part of a 61 member HOA in a 1,500 acre valley with a 100 acre lake with approximately 3 to 5 miles of hiking trails. The location of the trails is primarily known and used by HOA members. What are the pros and cons of publishing a map of the trails?
So I take it no one else is using the property, just those HOA members.
Sounds like it's
Is that
just
what he's
HOA.
saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that situation, I guess it's an interesting question of liability, even, who would the liability accrue to? I would assume the association has sufficient insurance, and the association can also be deemed, as the landowner or possessor of the land under the Recreational Users Statute. So that's probably going to be a pretty good case of immunity, but even so, showing that they have taken some steps to try to reduce risk. So I think the benefit of a map could be if there are things that people might not see that you want to make them aware of. A map could be helpful for that if you highlight that on the map.
Mm-hmm.
The downside, and I think this is what he's getting to, is if we publish that map, are we kind of opening it up to anybody and everybody using and more?
Right.
I'm guessing that's what he's getting at, but
Mhm.
that is definitely the downside, that you might increase the use in that area. But as I said, I think the recreational user statute's going to be pretty relevant to that situation and provide some good immunity. It's only those things that are just really completely catching someone unaware that can get through the recreational user statute. That one is, of all of the three, the most protective. So I think the only downside is, perhaps, that I can think of right offhand, is that fact that you could have increased use and just the increased possibility of an injury. Even so, the law probably will kick in and provide immunity.
Okay.
Sometimes insurance providers too, for those actions that you take, will take that, or either require that or take that into consideration with the coverage that they'll give you. So that could be another benefit.
Okay. So Bob asks, although we have good liability insurance coverage, it was suggested we also carry workers' compensation. We have no employees, no payroll. Should we still have workers' compensation?
Well, workers' comp would apply to farmers. So I guess if you're doing any farm type activities, I'm guessing that's where the suggestion comes from. We do need our farmers to still have workers' comp. But yeah, if you're just a landowner who has that woods for pleasure and you're not engaging in any kind of, commercial activities out there that we would deem agriculture or farming,
Mhm.
I'm not sure I would know why they're recommending that. There needs to be some kind of activity that it would apply to.
Okay. Mike asks, if I charge to stay in a house, VRBO and Airbnb, but allow free use of the trails, where might that fall on Ohio rec use?
Yeah. So when we look at first, the general duty, you're now in that higher duty since you're charging them, right?
Mhm.
But then we'd have to ask, well, could we make that a recreational activity while you're charging? So we don't do that. There's no equine involved, so that lands us down in the agritourism immunity statute as our only available immunity statute. So you need to qualify as a farm. I don't know if that is, did he say anything?
Didn't
It
say, just
suggested.
he's charges to stay in a house,
Yeah.
allows free use of the trails.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, can you separate charging for the house from free use of the trails? That's an
Right.
interesting question. That would be a little bit challenging, but I could see where you could have some language drafted in the contract for the house that would try to clarify that. But they're still on the property for your financial benefit. So I think it's a little risky. But then going back to the agritourism, if you are on a farm and the reason for them staying in that house on the farm is to engage in and experience agriculture, then even if you're benefiting, then you could get the immunity. So I don't know if that fits your situation either.
So I think he's also in the chat just now. He responded, said he is under CAUV, so it must be a farm.
Oh, okay. That helps a lot. Yeah. I would just try to make sure that that stay over, the farm stay, as we call it now, does somehow connect to having an agricultural experience. That's part of the purpose of the agritourism immunity law. You're bringing people onto the farm to allow them to, experience the farm. So I don't know, make them go out and collect a few eggs or something, and or go mushroom hunting, or yeah. But yeah, in that case, if they're that kind of a visitor they're there to experience the farm, then we can get the trails in under that one.
Okay. Teresa asks, what about liability protection for paid recreation such as camping, weekend rental, hiking trails, etc.? Are these covered, and where is that info found?
Yeah, so similar to the last question, if we're doing them on a farm as part of the farm experience, we could have the immunity. If we're charging for them though in a non-farm experience, then they're going to get kicked out of the recreational users statute. So in that case, what you need is good insurance coverage. You need to let your provider know this is what we're doing and make sure you have that adequate coverage through that route, because it's going to be harder off a farm without the agritourism law. If you're charging somebody, it's going to be harder, with the exception of equine activities, to have any kind of immunity protection.
Okay. Ronald asks, so would this situation be considered non-residential property when the trails do not go through an individual homeowner's property?
Yeah, that non-residential word is a little bit nondescript, and we haven't had any cases in Ohio that challenge that. But the intent of including non-residential in that statute is to say, this doesn't apply to, at your house, you have a pool party, we're not going to give you immunity. It's opening up your land to let people engage in recreational activities on their own. So that's what it's trying to get to. You know, if you're having guests over here, you know, at your house, we're not going to address that. But let's look beyond the house parcel, the house lot, and let's look at your other land. If you're letting people out there, then we're going to consider that non-residential. So yeah, definitely, if the trails don't come near the house, even if the house and the trails are on the same parcel, it doesn't say parcel, it says property. So we're looking out there in the non-residential parts of farms and residential or rural properties, and that's where we're going to allow that law to apply.
Okay. Susan asks, if your home is on your greater land parcel, house and trails on same single parcel,
Yeah.
would you be covered under the recreational user statute?
And I think you would. As I said, we haven't had that challenged in Ohio, but just knowing the intent of it, the intent is, yeah, beyond the home site, beyond those little recreational things you might do, really pool parties,
Mhm.
beyond there, even if it's on the same parcel, we're going to allow that law to apply.
Okay. Monty asks, what about others using chainsaws to cut wood on my property?
Yeah, so in that situation, we're going to put them in that middle category. And we're going to say that you do have a legal duty just to generally protect them from, take reasonable precautions to protect them from things that are out there that could harm them. But it's a general duty, and it's not going to be something that you could fit under an immunity law if they're cutting wood for themselves, even if you're not charging for them. I don't think a court would view that as a recreational activity, certainly not an equine activity and not an agritourism activity. So you're going to need to look to your property insurance and ask that question, what kind of protection do I have for this kind of situation? And that one I think is, from my experience, fairly well covered. It would be fairly well covered by insurance, and the fact that they're using at their own, upon their own need and desire, they're assuming the risk by using a dangerous piece of equipment that's their equipment that you have nothing to do with. So we really would just look to, is there really something big and obvious out there on your land that you should warn them about to stay away from? Now, a lot of people ask me about, well, what about dead trees? You don't have a duty to go out there and look for every dead tree that might fall on them. That would be a duty that we might place upon an urban landowner on a small lot where you can see your trees. But for those of us with a lot of trees on our properties, the law doesn't place that responsibility to go out and check for all dead trees that someone might encounter. I would still, though, walk the trails, and anything right by the trail, I would still take care of that, because even though you have immunity, you can't stop someone from suing you. So by doing those kinds of things, you're reducing the risk of being sued, even if you might be immune.
Right. Okay. So Carol asks, and I think this is part of, in one of the slides you had, said number 3, unseen conditions liable versus subsurface conditions not liable seems contradictory.
It is, and it depends, which law you're looking at. So what I think an easy way to think of it is, if it's something that you know about it as a landowner that a visitor wouldn't know about or have a chance to know about, that's what the law is trying to get to. They're a little less willing to allow you to be immune, or they're a little more willing to make you liable if it's something you knew but didn't share, and doing so could have really helped a person in that situation because it's something they couldn't have seen.
Okay.
But the other part of that is, when we're talking about equine and surface, it's placing a little more responsibility, because we know we're dealing with, hooved animals on surfaces. So it's putting a little more responsibility to be aware of that. What are those kind of latent conditions that might present a danger to a hooved animal trying to traverse that area.
Okay.
So in a way it makes sense, although it doesn't initially sound like it does.
Okay, so Tom asks, I own a home on 70 acres, which includes a 5-acre private lake and 60 acres of trailed hardwood stand. I am investigating turning the property into a vacation rental property like VRBO. Is it possible to create an executable release of liability document that would protect me?
It is. You need to go, have it drafted by an attorney who knows how to draft those. And I think it's important to remember it could protect you, but it's not foolproof. You're still going to have some responsibilities for maintaining and assessing that land, especially things that you know about. And you better have good insurance coverage. As I said before, that's really the best step you can take. I would go there before I'd go to a waiver.
Okay.
But both are advisable.
Okay, so Mary Lou says, so like a tree farm, people walk in the field to pick out trees, warning them of open holes and those kind of things would be on you to make certain folks knew there were those dangers, so to speak.
So one thing that we find a lot in litigation in this area is what is an open and obvious condition that people should know about. And if it's something open and obvious, the law is not willing to put that responsibility on the landowner. And it says, well, it's right there in front of you. You should have seen it. So I guess when it comes to things like, especially when we're talking about natural terrain, holes and how obvious is it they're on natural terrain, how much, should they assume is really the question. So those kinds of natural holes and, natural terrain type conditions are not something that the law expects you to worry about. But let's say you have a big tile blowout out there in the field where you want them to walk through. That's something you know about. It's not a natural condition, but it's really big and obvious. If they could see it, then the law says, well, you could see it. You should have protected yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's one of those that's, it's the landowner's call on how much do you want to worry? Because whenever we're talking about holes that cause people to fall, the most risky are going to be those kind of artificial ones that they couldn't see. So let's say you have an old mine, and it's covered, but it's not covered well, and they step on that and they fall in there, or an old well, something like that. Those are going to be high risk. Just a hole out in the field because of the natural terrain or an obvious tile blowout or something like that, low risk. So I would base your management on what's most comfortable to you in reducing your worry, because I think the risk is somewhat addressed through the law and of course through your insurance. Did that make sense, Kathy? I know
I
that's
think
kind
so.
of a
Yeah.
long-winded answer there.
Okay, so Carolyn asks, can you avoid liability by posting no trespassing signs?
No, that's unfortunately something that people misunderstand. The purpose of a trespassing sign is to let people know where your boundaries are. And when it comes to criminal trespass, we need to be able to show that they knew they were trespassing. But when it comes to liability, no, the warrant, a no trespassing sign gives no warning of any danger at all. If you want to reduce your liability for trespassers, then your sign should say warning X ahead or warning dangerous, or, it needs to let them know that there is something that could harm them. But just saying no trespassing, no, it's not useful at all when it comes to liability. It's just useful to show that they knew they shouldn't be there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Rick says, my ODNR forester directed that I conduct girdling of many trees in my woods and not to cut them down. allow them to fall down on their own. These standing dead trees are great for wildlife. My woods have no trespassing signs posted, and I do not give permission to hunters or trespassers to use the woods. Do I still have issues with these trees maybe falling on a trespasser?
Not if you don't know about the trespasser. So where I would worry is if you have a recurring trespass problem in the area of those trees, then there could be a little bit of risk. But when we're in a woods, dying trees and falling branches are kind of part of that assumption of risk
Yeah.
that we have when we're using a woods. And it's certainly when we're trespassing through a woods, then that's part of that risk that trespasser is assuming. But the only concern I'd have if you have evidence that someone is coming in and through right where you have some trees that are about to fall, you need to warn them to stay away. That unfortunately is a reality that many landowners don't like to hear because they're trespassing. Why should I have any
Right.
responsibility to them? Well, unfortunately, knowing that trespass, you don't even have to know the person, but just knowing that trespass is occurring, over and over again, you have evidence of it. There's a campsite. You can see that people have been camping there under where those trees are. Then put up a sign, rope it off, put some of that orange tape, do something to at least give them a heads up that, ooh, maybe I shouldn't go there. Well, right, you shouldn't be there in the first place,
Right.
but you shouldn't go toward that dangerous thing.
Okay. Okay. So Dub actually has two questions. So let's start with the first one. We have a 1,200-foot trail in our 3-acre woods in our condo property. Use is restricted to condo owners and their family. We have a map on our website identifying the 3 entrances to the trail. Trail is somewhat challenging to walkers, but most know that and do not use the trail. How good is our immunity?
When it comes to just natural conditions like that, where it's just a challenging, naturally dangerous kind of trail, you have pretty good protection from any liability for that because that's one of those things that falls into that. It's open and obvious. You can see that it's dangerous. You've assumed the risk of going ahead and encountering that situation. So I would say low in that regard. I do think though that the trail map on the website makes me a little nervous because it does kind of sound like an invitation, which would I think only increase the possibility of harm and litigation, but not necessarily the actual risk that you'd be liable for it.
Okay.
So it's that differentiation we were talking about before. You can always be sued. So do you want to try to reduce the risk of being sued?
Right.
You definitely want to reduce the risk that you'll be liable if you are sued, but do you also want to reduce the risk of being sued? You might want to make those trails less publicly available just to reduce that risk, but you probably wouldn't be liable anyway.
Okay.
But there are, that's true. There are lawsuit seekers out there.
Mhm. Always are.
Yeah.
So a second question is maintenance of our woods is done mostly by condo owners and volunteers. Is a writer recommended to cover those volunteers?
Yeah. Yeah. That's where the insurance companies could get into a battle.
Okay.
Whose insurance applies if one of those volunteers is harmed. And of course, the volunteer, their insurance provider is probably going to say, we don't cover those off-property activities. And they're going to try to force it on the association's insurance. But if there isn't good coverage there, then we're going to have to, of course, go to medical insurance and the person's medical insurance coverage. So it could have ramifications for those volunteers. It's really easy now, much easier than it used to be to get good volunteer insurance. So I think that would be advisable in that situation, especially doing that kind of work. because the medical insurance provider isn't going to want to cover it either. So you're just going to end up in a big battle over who's going to cover this. So let's make it a little more clear and make sure there's coverage by the association for that.
Okay. So we do have one that popped back up into the Q&A. Chuck asks, is the Ohio Forest tax law equal to CAUV when considering a farm commercial activity?
No, it's not.
I figure it was.
So but if it is commercial timber, and you're over 10 acres,
But you have to
then even though it's not CAUV, it still could qualify as a farm. If it's non-commercial, then it needs to be contiguous to some commercial acres that are engaged in
So
production.
for forest tax law, it's supposed to be commercial and it's a minimum of 10 acres.
Yeah, so that in that case, even though it's not CAUV, then it could still apply under the agritourism law as a farm engaged in agricultural production.
Okay.
I'm
'Cause you're
pretty
producing
sure.
timber,
Yeah.
commercial timber.
Yeah. They just don't reference that specific law and those requirements in it. But as we think through it, that would get them there, I think.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. That's all I have in the Q&A.
There are a few questions in the chat if you
Okay.
open it up. One from John and one from Tom.
Let me, how far up do I need to?
They're right, the last two.
I see one from Tom though that says, does EQIP and CSP qualified as a farm, periodic logging taking place? So that should still be.
That's further up, yeah.
Yeah. Follow up on the workers' comp question. Or farming operation under CAUV, but we have a hunting lease and harvest timber with no employees. Is workers' comp
Yeah.
still recommended?
Yeah, that's one of those things that confuses people. Workers' comp makes it, I think a lot of people think it's just for employees,
Paid
but no,
employees.
farmers need to have it on themselves as well. Yep.
Okay. John says, does granted permission for recreational use need to be in writing?
It doesn't, but of course it's going to be harder to prove if it's not. So if it's not in writing, just maybe have a witness, maybe document it somehow, take a note, make a, send yourself a text, something in your phone. I gave so-and-so permission to do this on this day, da, 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 da. You need some way of proving it. I know some people are uncomfortable with, oh, hey, here, sign this first. That would be the best practice to use. But if you're uncomfortable with that, then I encourage you to have a witness or document it in some way. Or be there when they show up, because that can work too. Yep, I was there. I let them go on.
Okay.
Yep.
So Tom asks, on a farm owned by a religious organization that provides farm education and spiritual retreats, are those attending the retreat immune when walking trails?
So are they charging for those retreats? I take it. He said it's a religious organization, but
it provides farm education and spiritual retreats. So I don't know if there's a cost or not.
Yeah. I'm just trying to figure, would that be a recreational use or would that be agritourism?
I mean, if you're there at the facility for a retreat, I don't know where that's like a meeting. So that probably is.
Yeah, but if there's farm education involved,
right,
then if it is a farm also that qualifies, that's engaging in commercial production as well as doing the retreats, then I think we could try to fit it under agritourism.
okay.
But we'd need to double check that. So in that case, you would be immune from those folks out, walking the trails if they're harmed. But again, even though it's an organization that may not be in the business of, making a lot of money from offering these retreats, I still would, take some practices to make sure those trails are relatively safe from those obvious things that you can see. even though the agritourism immunity law might apply.
Okay. We actually had a question pop back up in the Q&A. You're at 31 answered questions, Peggy. So see.
Goodness. Do I win a prize at the end of this? Is there like a $25,000 pyramid type prize?
I don't know. Gary asked, does the Division of Wildlife Hunting with Permission absolve the landowner from liability?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, our hunting law in Ohio. So we have two ways to have protection if we're talking about hunting. The first is a recreational user statute that I told you about. It specifically says hunting, but our hunting law says you must have permission from the landowner in order to hunt. And if you don't have permission, you can get into trouble. And then it says, and if you do or don't have permission, the landowner has no liability for you. But the one thing that makes me nervous about hunting is if you give too many people permission to be out there and oh, well, wait a minute, I've lost track. I've given so many people permission and there's no way for them to know who else is out there.
Right.
You've kind of set up a situation. I keep waiting for that to happen. That's the one case that I think could get a landowner in trouble. So if you are giving permission, sign it, you need to sign, of course, that's your documentation, but have them all park in the same place and let them know that, hey, I've given some other people permission, but you're only supposed to park here, and that will tell you whether there's anyone else out there. And I think that could absolve you.
So I make my hunters text me when they're going to be there. And that way I know who's on the farm and I can tell. So if one texts me and then another one texts me, I can text that person back and say, so-and-so is also on the farm.
Already out there.
Yeah. And so
that's good. That's a good practice.
I started that one because some of them park on the far end of the farm and I don't see their vehicles. And so it's definitely, I was just like, text me, just tell me you're coming. And that seems to work fairly well. I have one that doesn't
I like
text,
that.
But
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we've made it through all the questions, Peggy, with just a few minutes to spare before noon. So thank you so much. I think
Thank you, Peggy.
Great.
No, you're
info
welcome.
in there.
Yeah. Can I go to the beach now?